To historians is granted a talent that even the gods are denied to alter what has already happened. Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone, and the Libertarian Institute. Today, I am joined by Mark Weber. He is the director of the Institute for Historical Review, an independent public interest educational center in Southern California that works to promote peace, understanding, and justice through greater public awareness of the past. In particular, the IHR strives to increase understanding of the causes, nature, and consequences of war and conflict. Mr. Weber, thank you so much for your time. Where is the best place to find the Institute for Historical Review's collection of work?
The best place is on our main website, which is ihr.org, ihr.org. And you'll find a vast library of material, very extensive. We have an audio section, a video section. Then we also have an IHR store section, which offers a wide variety of books and discs that I think people will find of interest. But it's very helpful to use the search feature because using that, one can find things related to different subjects. Many articles also have links to other things. We have a links section as well. So I urge everybody to take a look at that. We update the main website several times a week. We also have a free IHR News and Comment email service, and we send out roundups of items that we think are of more topical or interest to people. So I urge everybody to take a look at that.
Absolutely. The link to ihr.org will be in the description below. Mr. Weber, when I think of history, the definition I get is a chronological record of events as of the life or development of a people or institution, often including an explanation of or commentary on those events. One might say, well, history, that is boring stuff that's already happened. I'm a progressive. I care about the future. I don't want to be tied down by the past. Why does history matter?
Well, that's what we try to deal with constantly, because one of the features of American life today, particularly nowadays, is the big emphasis on me, how I feel about this. And there's a huge tendency that one person's truth is just as good as another person's truth. But the emphasis on the me means that it's a strong tendency to just forget about, as you say, the past. Who cares about the past? In fact, many Americans have for a long time taken a certain amount of pride in feeling that the United States is not like other countries and that we're not burdened by the heavy hand of history. We just get the job done. We just go ahead and solve problems. We just make life better, and we don't care what the customs, the habits of people in the past, monarchies or hierarchies or all that kind of thing. That doesn't matter, but it does matter. And it's especially important right now because America today is embarking, and has been for some time now, embarks on a huge effort to rewrite history, to remake actually America or redefine America. We're often accused of, well, you people want to rewrite history. Well, of course, history is always being rewritten from perspectives that are new insights, new evidence, but also just a new perspective. And nowhere has we've seen in, I think, in recent years, such a rewriting of history as we're seeing right now. An example of that is just recently, the New York Times launched this so-called 1619 project, which is supposed to redefine the decisive date in which America was defined as a country. And for the New York Times, in this big project, the whole issue of the New York Times Magazine was devoted to this. 1619, that is when the first black slaves were brought to America, that's supposed to define America. But it's much more complicated than that. But the big thing is that how we look at the past is very important, how we look at ourselves in the present and how we look at our future. Because even if people say they're not driven by any particular ideology, they just get the job done, everyone in individuals and a society operates on the basis of certain premises, certain prevailing principles that we all sort of understand or which are given to us by the media. And whether we acknowledge them or not, they still play a very important role. And by understanding history, we can measure the validity of all sorts of premises in our own society much better. But certainly this is important at a time in America today where we're going into a whole new era in which just in the last 10, 15, 20 years, American figures of the past who were revered and honored are now, their statues are being torn down. We're told that they were terrible people. That's a pretty dramatic thing. And so making sense of our own time, and even more than that, making sense of the future is only possible if we understand the trajectory of the past.
There was a great economist at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Hans Hermann Hoppe, wrote a paper titled The Libertarian Quest for Grand Historical Narrative. He said, because the general public is not used to or incapable of abstract reasoning, high theory, and intellectual consistency, but it forms its political views and convictions on the basis of historical narratives, i.e., of prevailing interpretations of past events. And hence, it is upon those who want to change things for the better, libertarian future, to change and correct such interpretations and propose and promote alternative revisionist historical narratives. So whether you love or hate what he said about, being part of the classical liberal libertarian view, he's still emphasizing the fact that what we know today and how we make decisions is based off word association games. Hitler, bad; Churchill, good. And when those are put into, the commonplace today, it's how we make our decisions with whatever we associate happened in the past.
Right.
At IHR, you discuss revisionist history. What is revisionist history, and what does it mean to revise historical events?
Before you get into that, I want to highlight a phrase you use, this importance of the narrative. This is really important. It's really not just the facts of history, it's the narrative. It's the overall sweep of how we see the relationship between the past and the present. To make a generalization, I would say in America, a very common, widely accepted narrative by people who call themselves conservatives as well as liberal Democrats and Republicans both accept is the idea of America as a country dedicated to a proposition of equality, of universalism, and that we've seen this trajectory over American history in which voting used to be restricted to a small number of people, and then the property qualifications were done away with, religious qualifications were done away with. Eventually, women got to vote, blacks were able to vote. And with the idea that America is a country that's a great country and always getting better, always striving, always coming closer to this ideal of ever greater equality and ever greater universalistic society. That's a very, very strong narrative that's widely accepted in America. And it's the narrative also behind the Black Lives Matter movement, the gay rights movement. All of those movements are in keeping with this narrative that there's always one more battle to be fought in the never-ending struggle for ever greater equality, ever greater inclusivity in American society. Now, that's a narrative that's basically accepted. Now, whether one agrees or not, that narrative is so powerful and so that the discussions that take place in the political sphere and social sphere and so forth all refer back to that, even implicitly oftentimes, because it's widely accepted. But to go back about the second part was about why does you phrase it again for me.
The part where I asked you what is revisionist history, or
well, yes,
back to the quote?
Revisionist history is really all real history is revisionist history. If it wasn't, we wouldn't be writing new books about history all the time. Historians are always writing, in a sense, revisionist history, because revision just means from the Latin, to take another view. And we always take new views of history based on the prevailing premises and ideology of the time. In an era in which religion was very important, Christianity was very important, the past, the present, everything was looked at from that point of view. In a similar way, the kind of narrative of equality, liberal democracy, which is the prevailing ideology of America and Western Europe today, history is looked upon from that point of view. And so history is constantly being reevaluated from the point of view of not only perspective, ideology, but also on the basis of new facts. We learn new things that we didn't know before about history. There's just fascinating things happening all the time. One of the most interesting, as a kind of a footnote in a sense, was several years ago, a very sophisticated clockwork device was found in the Aegean Sea in Greece that showed before, up until that time, not understood level of sophistication about astronomy and about mechanics with gear wheels and so forth, that showed a far higher level of sophistication in ancient Greek society than people had realized. And anyway, there's other examples that one can give about that. But more than that, it's not just the perspective, it's also what we emphasize. It's not that people who differ about history lie, it's that they emphasize different things. Today in recent, one example is Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson was a popular president of the United States when he was reelected in 1912, and then elected in 1912, reelected in 1916, got America in the First World War. After the dismay after the First World War, then he was not very popular. Then his popularity rose again when America got in the Second World War, because he was considered a person who was progressive and understood America's important role in the world. Now, Woodrow Wilson is in, his reputation is very bad because he was a racist. He was a person who reimposed segregation in the federal bureaucracy in Washington, D.C., but he's considered bad. And there's very little discussion about, well, what used to be the main criticism of Woodrow Wilson, and that was his, I would think, unrealistic foreign policy and involving America in the First World War and its role in the peace after the First World War. But my point is that Woodrow Wilson's reputation has gone up and down over history, depending on what the prevailing values and outlook is of the time we're talking about. At the beginning of the Second World War, America's role in the Second World War, I think it was Warner Brothers, MGM, put out a big a color motion picture, praising Woodrow Wilson to try to boost up his popularity, and it did a lot of good. Our narrative of history is very heavily influenced by Hollywood, by motion pictures, by television, by what our educators tell us. And so when Dwight Eisenhower was president of the United States, he had a picture of Robert E. Lee in the White House. And he wrote a famous letter in which he explained why he admires Robert E. Lee. Well, that's unthinkable now, practically. There's this Robert E. Lee, his statues are being taken down all over the place. He was a slaveholder. He's now called a traitor, a bad guy, and so forth. And if there's any real dramatic rewriting or revision of history, it's not merely in tweaking history, it's in tearing down the once honored place that many people had in American history up until a few years ago, and have now been torn down and are considered not merely, objectionable men, all of them men, by the way, but also evil men, really bad men, people we should turn away from. And of course, we've seen in the last year the enormous adulation of this man George Floyd, who unfortunately died. But it's hard to believe that any American society or any society would have elevated this character to this eminence in society as George Floyd would. Anyway, it's happening all the time, and it's happening even more rapidly in America today because America is going through a very, very severe crisis of identity. What does it mean to be American? What does America even mean? What's the purpose, and what's the very definition of the United States of America? And those kind of questions, or questions that fundamental, were not even being asked 10 or 20 years ago. People more or less assumed and took for granted the prevailing view that, well, this is all good, America was founded for good reasons, and so forth. Now that is all being questioned by and especially with an administration in the White House who is pledged to uproot what it calls systemic racism that it says is so badly entrenched in American society from 1619 to the present.
What methods can we use to determine whether or not something is true or false with regard to a historical event?
Well, you could spend years trying to figure it out yourself. One thing to do is this. First of all, you can find more or less a consensus by people about what actually happened. That's not too difficult. What's more important is to try to understand how important this event or that event really is. During the past week, there was a tremendous amount in the newspapers, in the television, in the media about the anniversary of the Tulsa race riots or massacre of 1921. Well, that's not new. We all knew that. I mean, anybody who cared would know about that. It's not a new thing. But the emphasis on it has made people give it an attention we didn't have before. But the point is, it's not so much the events that are in question, it's our interpretation of them. And so in evaluating that, try to see things from a detached perspective. Just as when we try to understand human beings on an individual basis, we try to see how they act in relationship to other people and other situations, and then we form an impression, an evaluation of their character, what they're like, and so forth. The same thing is with historical events or narratives of history. We try to see them in a larger perspective, and that's one thing. But the other and most obvious one is that for most people, it's based on trust, because we don't have the time, either in medical field or in history, to do a whole lot of research and investigation ourselves. We have to trust somebody. And so to a great degree, we have to think, well, these people or that source is more reliable than this one, or that perspective is one I embrace or understand more. That's an important thing. And that's why the Libertarian Institute, I think, has a good record of presenting history and so forth in a way that's reliable and trustworthy. And of course, it has its agenda, or it has its perspective, you could say, but so does everyone. And to a great degree, our individual perspective on the past is going to be influenced tremendously by those sources that we regard as trustworthy. That's an important thing. And so that's why I recommend look at the IHR, of course. Now, the IHR, unlike, I don't know, Fox News maybe, does assume a higher level of nuance or sophistication or background knowledge than the popular television media does. And so it's really not meant for the mass of ordinary people. We're not trying to compete with Fox News or trying to compete with Twitter or Facebook, although we have a presence on some of the social media. What we're trying to do is influence younger people, especially, who can and I think will be leaders in the future if we're to have any kind of future as a country or as a society.
So the following questions are going to be intentionally vague because I want to give you as much wiggle room as you'd like. What were the primary causes of the First World War?
Well, one of the, we'll probably get into this, but one book I very much recommend, in fact, I have on our website a study guide or a recommended reading list about a whole lot of different subjects. And one of the books I recommend very strongly for people who want a introductory work on 20th century, the First and Second World Wars, I recommend very highly the book Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War by Patrick J. Buchanan. Patrick Buchanan is familiar, I'm sure, to most of your viewers, listeners, through his columns and through other books he's written. But Patrick Buchanan's book is not a book of groundbreaking, path-breaking history, but Pat Buchanan is a very gifted narrator and synthesizer. He's able to present things in a digestible, understandable way, and he has the intelligence and ability to bring together a whole lot of material from different sources in a way to make it understandable and digestible. And so I recommend that book very much. And in that book, he deals with the origins of the First World War and the Second World War. But one of the features one of the points he makes very strongly is the role that Britain especially had in pushing for war and making war inevitable in both cases. And if you might say, the bad guy in Pat Buchanan's book is Winston Churchill, who played a role in both the First and Second World Wars. And he has a very, very strong criticism of what he calls the Churchill cult, and especially Churchill is very popular among conservatives, because with the Second World War, conservatives have, of all the leaders of different countries during the Second World War, they're not very enthusiastic about Franklin Roosevelt for a lot of reasons. He was a Democrat, he was a liberal. They don't like Hitler or Stalin, obviously. So almost by default, the good guy is Winston Churchill. And of course, his rhetoric was inspiring, and movies have been made about his speeches, although that's a whole nother subject. But Pat Buchanan has written a book that tries very hard to dismantle, you might say, this edifice of Winston Churchill. But with regard to the First World War, one of the features of the First World War is how no one at the beginning of the war in any of the countries of Europe wanted anything like the war that finally developed. And this is a very important point about war in general. And it's a point I've made in many, many talks. Almost no war develops as anyone at the beginning thought it would develop. That was true of the American Civil War. It was true of the First World War. It was true of the Second World War. Certainly true of the Vietnam War. It's true of the Iraq War. Wars take on a dynamic all their own. And I plead very strongly that leaders always be very, very cautious about doing anything to ignite a war, because very rarely do they work out well the way people expect. And that's very, very true of the First World War. When the First World War began in 1914, and there was a lot of enthusiasm, because patriotic enthusiasm in Britain, in France, in Germany, across Europe, in various countries for it. An enthusiasm that broke down pretty quickly when it became obvious that this war was going to be a terrible, bloodletting mess that dragged on for 4 years and left all of Europe, even the victors, distraught, destroyed, and ruined. No country worse off than France, which lost so many men, even though it was so-called on the winning side. And Pat Buchanan emphasizes that, and those people who are familiar with Pat Buchanan's columns knows how much he has warned against the dangers of alliances, military alliances that obligate countries, particularly the United States, to get involved in wars in which they don't really have a vital interest. And this is particularly true of the First World War. What happened is when countries began taking sides, inevitably the alliances that had been made brought countries, everybody, into this war, even when the interests were not really very vital. I mean, on an extended level, say Canada, South Africa, Australia got involved in the First World War, even though the dispute, the issues of dispute in the First World War had nothing really essential to do with the interests, even the awareness of people in Australia, New Zealand, or other countries. But they were all tied through alliances of one kind or another that brought all these countries into this terrible conflict, at the end of which all of Europe was really ruined. Now, Americans don't really look at war the same way that people in other countries do. And that's because, with the exception of the American Civil War, our wars have always been far away from our shores. Except for the people actually getting shot or killed or wounded in the battle, our wars don't really affect us the way the others. And this is something I learned at a very young age when I first was living in Europe, that people in Japan or Europe, Poland, Germany, France, and England, and so forth, look at war in a very different way. Americans are very used to talking very lightly, very flippantly almost, about, well, if some country causes a problem, we'll just turn their country into a parking lot, or we'll just bomb them. Because win or lose, life goes on more or less the same in America, no matter what happens. Wars don't mean that for other countries. The Second World War was an utterly destructive thing for Japan, or for China, or for Poland, or Germany. It was also very destructive in France, and of course in Russia. But in America, during the Second World War, the economy boomed. There were jobs aplenty. Life was better, except for the people actually, as I said, in the war. The Second World War was a good time for America, and America came out of the Second World War economically dominant in the world. The rest of the world was in ruins, was on its back. And so we look at wars very differently. Even the Vietnam War, which I remember when I was young, how divisive and how bad that was, it didn't affect us at all in the way that affected people in Vietnam. Anyway, the point is, though, that the First World War and, of course, the Second World War were very destructive, but both of those wars were very, in a sense, good, if you can use that word, for America, because America came out of it as the top dog in the world economically, financially, even militarily, in the case of the Second World War. And so we don't look at war in the same way, with the same dread that people do around the world, who have suffered the consequences of it in a very direct and horrifying way.
Any more causes of the First World War that we could get a general understanding of before we go into the interim and the Second World War?
Well, the big thing is that none of the issues of the First World War were worth the enormous cost of life and destruction that came out of it. I mean, the immediate issue was over Serbia's role with Austria. Austria was unhappy because Serbian nationalists were inciting fellow Serbs and Slavs in South Austria and in the southern part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Then Austria gave an ultimatum to Serbia. Serbia refused. Austria declares war. Russia mobilizes its forces because it feels obliged to defend Serbia in this thing. Germany then, because the Russian mobilization is aimed at Germany, then Germany declares war on Russia. France declares war. Anyway, the thing spins completely out of control. And at the end of it all, I think it's fair to say none of it was worth whatever the issues were, and they were relatively minor ones that could have been dealt with. None of it was worth the enormous expense and destruction of it. And there's two things. First of all, Britain's decisive role. Britain could have, that Buchanan argues, other historians have argued, could have played a role to have ended the war or brought the war probably to an earlier conclusion if it had not itself gotten involved. And the second point is that alliances that obligate countries to go to war should be entered into very, very cautiously, because they often are tripwires that have consequences far beyond what we ever expect.
Yeah, I think Buchanan says that the British justification was from an 1839 treaty that if Belgium's neutrality was ever violated, Britain would come into war on behalf of Belgium. And because Germans crossed through Belgium to get to France, they said, oh, that declares war. And then they have the fake babies on bayonets that the Bryce report gave us. So that's an excellent point. Well, people don't think that alliances are often tripwires is a great way to say it.
Not only that, oftentimes the pretext for a war is not the real reason why countries go to war. The pretexts are given for public relations benefit. Remember, the Iraq War was sold to the American public on the basis of claims that turned out not to be true. But that's not the real reason why we got into that war. But that's a subject for another podcast, I suppose.
Exactly.
Scott Horton has gone into that, I think, in a very detailed way, of course.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I just want to quote Churchill from 1938. This is a brand new copy that I got from IHR of Hitler, Churchill, and the Unnecessary War. So this is in 1938. Churchill replied that Londonderry, oh my gosh, I can't pronounce that, was mistaken in supposing that I have an anti-German obsession. Churchill went on to explain, British policy for 400 years has been to oppose the strongest power in Europe by weaving together a combination of other countries strong enough to face the bully. Sometimes it is Spain, sometimes it is the French monarchy, sometimes the French Empire, sometimes Germany. I have no doubt about it now, but if France set up to claim the overlordship of Europe, I shall equally endeavor to oppose them. It is thus through the centuries we've kept our liberties and maintained our life and power. Right. Looking at the First World War, doesn't British supremacy seem like much, and Germany being a threatening rival, isn't that a much better explanation than violating Belgium neutrality?
And in fact, a very similar quote is also in the first volume of Churchill's own 6-volume history of the Second World War. He makes the point, see, at the time, he's saying, oh, we've got to stop Hitler because he's really evil, he's really bad, this is why we got to go. But he himself quotes from an earlier speech in the 30s that we're not opposing Germany because it's particularly bad. Britain had opposed Philip II of Spain. It had opposed Napoleon and Louis XIV in France. Britain had a long policy of what it called balance of power, of making alliances with other countries in Europe to offset any country that seemed to be dominant on the continent. The problem is that very often countries that are powerful, like Britain was at the beginning of the 20th century, miscalculate their power. They think they can hold on to it when the world reality has changed. And this is a point Pat Buchanan has made many times about America's place in the world today. Many American leaders seem to talk as if America, with just the right tweaking or the right policy, can return to the days of the 1960s or 70s when America was able to basically snap its fingers and the world responded. That world is gone. America emerged from the Second World War as by far the most important economic financial power in the world. At the end of the Second World War, something like 90% of the automobiles in the world were produced by the big three of Detroit: General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford. Today, China every year produces more automobiles than the United States and Japan combined. Up until the Reagan years, America was from the end of the Second World War up to the Reagan years, America was the #1 creditor nation in the world. Since then, it's been the #1 debtor nation in the world. There's no going back. The world has built up from the destruction after the end of the Second World War, and China is, or very soon will be, equal or greater economically than the United States. And the danger is, like Britain at the beginning of the 20th century, acting as if it can still play the dominant role that it used to play when the reality had changed. And more specifically with the First World War, the rise of Germany and the unification of Germany at the end of the 19th century, Germany was so much more efficient or powerful on the continent that the old balance of power policy was never going to really work again. I mean, and it didn't work in the First World War. It certainly didn't work in the Second World War. In the Second World War, Britain came out on the winning side, but it certainly didn't win the war. The dominant powers at the end of the Second World War wasn't Britain. It was the Soviet Union and the United States. And for the first time in European history, outer European states came to dominate Europe, each of them with their own ideologies and so forth. And Churchill himself ends his 6th-volume history of the Second World War. The final volume is entitled Triumph and Tragedy, because the tragedy, he says, is at the end of all this terrible suffering, Britain was faced, he says, with threats and dangers as great, if not greater, than they faced in 1939. And that's a very, very sad commentary on the tremendous suffering and cost and misery that the Second World War brought, at the end of which it's still in this very terrible way threatened this time then at the end of the Second World War by the country that was its ally during the Second World War, namely the Soviet Union.
And finally, just to finish off the end of the 19 teens, I guess, what was the Balfour Declaration of 1917?
Well, the Balfour Declaration, this is also some would say an example of what they call English perfidious Albion, the English duplicity. Britain during the First World War was promising the Arabs that if they sided with Britain against the Ottoman Empire, which was allied to Germany, the Arabs would have freedom and Palestine would be an Arab state. They promised at the same time to the Jews that if the Jews supported Britain in the First World War, that they would have a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And they made, and then secretly the British and the French each divvied up the whole Arab world among themselves in another treaty, the Sykes-Picot Treaty. So there were 3 conflicting promises the British were given about what was going to happen to the Arab countries. And the Balfour Declaration was a pledge, a public pledge by Lord Balfour. The text was actually in the form of a letter to Lord Rothschild, who played a very large role in British business and political life in Britain during the war, a pledge that if the Jews of the world or if Jewry supported Britain, then Britain would, in return, pledge to support what they called a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And it's vaguely worded. Does that mean that Palestine will be a Jewish state, or does it mean Jews will be able to settle there? That's typical of how these kind of diplomatic statements are worded. But what it did, it was important not so much for Jews in Britain, but for Jews in the United States, because at the beginning of this First World War, most Jews around the world supported the Central Powers. They supported Germany and its allies, not Britain and France, because Britain and France were allied with Tsarist Russia. And for most Jews at the beginning of the First World War, the big bad guy in the world was the Tsarist Russia, whose the policies of Russia, the Russian Empire, were openly hostile to Jews. And so, and what Jews did very well actually at that time in Germany. And so the majority of public opinion at the beginning of the First World War in America by American Jewish organizations was actually, if anything, sympathetic to Russia, but very, very hostile sympathetic to Germany, but hostile to Russia. So the Balfour Declaration was an attempt to win over especially support from American Jews and to get America to support. That was issued in 1916. And all that changed in 1917 when the Tsar was overthrown, so that became a thing. But anyway, it laid the seeds, though, for the problems we've seen with, of course, the establishment of the State of Israel and all of that ever since. But Britain played this duplicitous and two-faced role in making one promise to the Arabs, another promise to the Jewish organizations, Zionist groups, and then a third promise, a secret treaty with the French to divvy the whole thing up and control it among themselves.
What are some important things to know about the Treaty of Versailles?
Well, of course, Pat Buchanan, and again, much has been written and said about the Treaty of Versailles, but that's the treaty that was cobbled together at the end of the First World War and Germany was forced to sign it. It was a humiliating treaty for Germany, one that no leader of any stature in Germany could in good conscience accept. I mean, if for no other reason, just on moral grounds, because the Treaty of Versailles insisted that Germany alone has to bear the responsibility for the destruction of the First World War. That's a view that not only historians, I don't think, historians do not agree with, certainly Germans did not agree with. And so the treaty was considered a humiliation. But more than that, it was a violation of promises, grave pledges, serious pledges made by the United States and endorsed by Britain and France when Germany laid down its arms in November of 1918 and agreed to an armistice, agreed to the end of the war. At the end of the war, German troops were still in France and Belgium. Germany had not been overrun or defeated. And Germany laid down its arms on the basis of these very solemn pledges made by Wilson, and which Wilson got the British and French to support. But then he broke these pledges. Basically, the principle of self-determination was given to other people, but not to Germans. The Allies claimed that, well, if Germany just gets rid of the Kaiser and has a democratic government, a Republican government, then everything will be forgiven. We'll just go back to the good old days. Well, that's not what happened. And Germany was treated very shamefully. And understandably, this was a source of tremendous resentment in Germany, and one of the reasons why the government, the democratic government that was set up in Germany after the First World War, was so unpopular with so many people. It was weighted down with with reparations that went on. I mean, impossible to pay, couldn't even calculate them. It also meant the breaking up of Eastern Europe and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and was economically very destructive for much of Europe because the trading patterns, all of the economic life of Eastern Europe had been in place for centuries, and all that was disrupted very rashly, brutally, you might say, by the Treaty of Versailles. Anyway, the Treaty of Versailles, I mean, for example, one of the pledges made by Wilson is that the claims of colonies that all the countries had would be looked at judiciously and equally, including the German claims. That wasn't happening at all. What happened was all of Germany's colonies were just confiscated and turned over to the British and the French. Anyway, all this was really not only harmful for Germany, but humiliating as well. And it represents really a low point in American diplomacy because Woodrow Wilson had gone into the war with all these high-flown rhetoric about how America was going to fight for a new world in which there would never again be war. It would be a war permanently for democracy in the world. Well, it didn't happen that way at all. I mean, not only German Americans were unhappy, the Irish Americans were very happy because Wilson was pledging self-determination for everybody, but not for Ireland, for example. The Irish were very unhappy about that. And there were many other examples of this too. The Japanese were very unhappy. They were Chinese were very unhappy because the former German, you might say, colony on the Shantung Peninsula was turned over to Japan. And there was no self-determination there for the Chinese living there. Anyway, all of this was a reason why millions of Americans were so disgusted by the Treaty of Versailles, by Wilson's failure to live up to the pledges he had made to justify America's role in the First World War, that then in the early 1930s, the American Congress, with wide support from the American public, passed a series of neutrality laws to try to avoid America's involvement in any new conflict as America had been involved in the First World War.
What were the primary causes of the Second World War?
Well, what you often hear from people is the Second World War began when Germany attacked Poland on September 1st, 1939. A.J.P. Taylor was an outstanding historian of the 20th century, and he says, well, that's a date you can choose, but for Chinese, the war began earlier than that, when the Japanese invaded China. For Russians, the war didn't really begin until the 22nd of June, 1941. Actually, for even Britain and France, it didn't begin until 2 days later when Britain and France declared war on Germany because Germany had attacked Poland. I mean, you can say the Second World War, began when Germany attacked Poland, but that's really not true. It's more accurate to say that a localized conflict between Germany and Poland became a continental-wide war when Britain and France declared war against Germany on the 3rd of September, much to the shock and chagrin of German leaders who did not think or expect or want a larger war. Nobody in Germany really wanted a larger war. They thought, there's a lot more to be said about that. So even dating the beginning of the Second World War is a dubious thing, depending on what country you're talking about. For the Poles, it began on the 1st of September. But the Second World War, that is a worldwide war, really wasn't a total worldwide war until finally the United States became overtly involved with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and then the war between Japan, when Japan and the United States became involved, then it became truly a global war. But essentially the Soviet Union was out of it. And for the French, well, the French declared war. Then in May 1940, Germany attacked France after pleading, please, let's end the war. France was out of the war after 6 weeks of fighting. And then they weren't involved in the war again until 1944, exactly when Americans then and British and so forth landed in Normandy. So it depends on your perspective, you might say, when the Second World War began. In fact, in Russia today, they celebrate every year what they call Victory Day on the 9th of May, because for Russia, the war ended on the 9th of May. For America, it ended on the war in Europe ended on the 8th of May, but the war in the Pacific didn't end until August. But the Soviets don't really care about the Second World War. They care about what they call the Great Patriotic War, the war that involved them. And that's understandable because each country looks at these conflicts in a very different way depending on their own perspective.
So I want to go to the 3rd of September, 1939. Here is Neville Chamberlain, who at the time was the prime minister. He said, this morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that we were prepared at once to withdraw, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you that no such undertaking has been received and that consequently, this country is at war with Germany. I don't know what age I was at, but I remember being pretty embarrassingly old when I found out that it was the UK that declared war on Germany and not the other way around. I had always assumed that it was, Hitler invading all these countries, and then the UK was, please, can we appease you? What can we do? Next thing you know, he's invaded the UK, and then their arm is twisted into going to war. I had no clue it was a dispute. I'm sorry to derail this, but do you have any information on what the Danzig dispute was with Poland and Germany?
Germany had, up until September 1939, been able to overturn what they consider the most humiliating features of the Versailles Treaty peacefully. With Austria, Austria was made an independent country. Despite the wishes of the people of Austria, the Germans of what they call the Sudetenland and what is now Czechia or Czech Republic, they were put in a new country contrary to what they wanted. There was other things that happened, other similar things, and Hitler was able, without war, to sort of deal with all of these things. And he thought at the beginning of 1939 that asking Poland to agree that Danzig, which was a city on the Baltic that had been German city for centuries, be returned to Germany. People should understand, the German city of Danzig on the Baltic was a link to the Baltic Sea for Poland, but the population of Danzig was German, and the area right around it was mostly German. And that area was taken away, given to either Poland or made a so-called city-state under the League of Nations against the wishes of the people there to give Poland an outlet to the sea. And Hitler tried to say to the Poles, okay, let's work out something here so at least the people have the justice and the what they want. Now, people will say, well, Hitler didn't really mean what he said. He was lying. Maybe, maybe not. But the way to test that isn't just to attack, it's to take him at his word. Okay, let's try to work it. But anyway, Poland was fortified by the pledge given in March 1939 by Britain that Britain would back Poland if there was any conflict with Germany. And both Patrick Buchanan and many other historians have made the point that this was a fatal blunder because Britain committed itself to support Poland no matter how unreasonable Poland was. This is a dangerous thing. And Pat Buchanan has made the point many times that similar American pledges to a range of countries in Eastern Europe is similarly dangerous. And this is, anyway, Pat Buchanan spends much of his book emphasizing the very dangerous pledge, open-ended, blank check pledge, you could say, to Poland. And the great tragedy of all of this is that Britain went to war against Germany in 1939 because Poland's sovereignty and independence was threatened by Germany. At the end of 6 years or 5.5 years of terrible conflict, Poland was under complete Soviet domination. In other words, the reason Poland gave for going to war was to try to bring about a goal that was never achieved even after terrible war was over. And particularly for Poles, this is a grave, grave tragedy. And also, of course, when the war began, the British and French both pledged that they would go in with swords and sabers and flags and so forth to go to war against Germany, and they didn't do that. They sort of sat on their heels, and Poland was subdued in 6 weeks or so, and then attacked on the east by the Soviets. Of course, the British, if they really cared about Polish sovereignty, they should have declared war on the Soviet Union too, but they didn't do that.
I mean, and the Soviets invaded, I think it was like 2 or 2.5 weeks later.
Right.
It was, I mean, almost like they had, was there an actual agreement? Is that what the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was?
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, which was made in August, shortly before the German attack, only divided Poland and that area into spheres of influence. It didn't mean necessarily that the Polish state would be eliminated, but because the Germans, even in a speech given in October, Hitler didn't rule out that there would be a Polish state. but the Polish government fled. There was nobody. I mean, there was no really people even to operate. The Polish went as government exile, refused to negotiate, and the Soviets invaded from the east and just simply incorporated the territories that they took from Poland, which is actually a larger territory than the Germans took, and incorporated it directly into the Soviet Union. But yeah, it's on the basis of this treaty, but it didn't. The treaty, or it's a secret clause of the August 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement, did not necessarily preclude that there wouldn't be didn't mean that there wouldn't be a Polish state. But anyway, that's the way it worked out, and that's what happened. Yeah.
What are some important things to know about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor?
Well, there's a museum in Japan dedicated to Japan's role in the Second World War. And it, of course, presents all of this from a Japanese point of view. But the big point of Japan attacked at Pearl Harbor on the, as it turned out, very foolish calculation that the United States would not retaliate or be bent on destroying Japan in retaliation for that. But the main problem, the reason why Japan took that rash a step to attack the United States of America was because Japan was facing economic ruin. It's very important to remember that at that time, the major source of Japanese petroleum was from the United States. The United States was a major oil producing country. And other sources of petroleum in the world, they just simply were not accessible to Japan. If Japan had accepted Japan faced ruin one way or the other. As one Japanese historian said, not attacking Pearl Harbor would have meant accepting the consequences of a defeat in war without even fighting a war. And that's why Japan attacked, because they thought, well, okay, we're going to attack the United States. They thought the blow would be so stunning, America would just sort of allow Japan to take over areas of Southeast Asia and thereby maintain itself as a modern industrial state. But see, the Japanese were not madmen, although obviously in retrospect it was very foolish for them to have done that, because they didn't have a proper understanding of the mood and the likelihood of how the United States would respond to that. But be that as it may, the United States had been carrying out a policy very much directed against Japan for a long time, up until Pearl Harbor. The best single book on that subject is one that we sell, in fact we publish, called Pearl Harbor, by George Morgenstern, who was for years a writer for the Chicago Tribune. And it's probably still, despite the passage of time, the best single volume history or examination of how it came to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and then the war between the United States and Japan.
Is the Morgenstern book where he quotes Henry Stimson's diary? Is that?
I don't remember. I mean, it's been so widely quoted, I don't remember who quotes it where. But yeah, Henry Stimson even wrote in his diary, well, the trick is here, how do we get the Japanese to fire the first shot so we don't look like we're starting the war? But Simpson also wrote, too, something like, we've already, and this was true not only with regard to Japan, but even more true with regard to Germany, up until that time, the United States actions had been very overtly belligerent against Germany and Italy and Japan, and they were acts of war. They were acts that they had fired on German ships, they had seized German property, they had given military aid to both the Soviet Union, the United States gave military aid to both the Soviet Union and Britain. All that are just blatantly unneutral acts carried out by the United States. And Stimson also wrote that Germany already has every excuse in the world to declare war on the United States. But Hitler, of course, didn't want to provoke a war with the United States at that point, because his hands were, he had plenty to do trying to subdue the Soviet Union, because at the beginning, in December 1941, German troops were battling furiously just outside of Moscow against the Red Army. And that was the major, of course, focus of the German war effort at that point.
There is an article published by the New York Times on January 2nd, 1972, titled War Entry Plans Laid to Roosevelt. It said Churchill's account of Roosevelt's attitude toward the war was contained in the minutes of that cabinet meeting. This is a meeting in August of 1940 in Canada. The minutes, quoting Churchill, indirectly said he, Roosevelt, obviously was determined that they should come in. If he were to put the issue of peace and war to Congress, they would debate it for months, the cabinet minutes added. The president had said he would wage war but not declare it, and that he would become more and more provocative. If the Germans did not like it, they could attack American forces. The president's orders to these U.S. Navy escorts were to attack any German U-boat which showed itself, even if it were 200 or 300 miles away from the convoy. Everything was to be done to force an incident. That is Churchill's own words, published in the New York Times. And I was always taught that, we're this stupid isolationist nation who just thought we could, who was just focused on the New Deal, and then out of nowhere, our hand is, our arm is twisted into another war that we so heavily resisted, and it's not the case at all.
Right. No, this is a very important point. I've written extensively on this subject. There's a great deal on our website about the deceit, the lies of the Roosevelt administration to try to get the American public to go along with his efforts to get the United States in war. And I've written extensively, not merely on what you're referring to. This is from August 1940. Even before the outbreak of war in September 1939, Roosevelt was giving pledges to the Poles, to the British, and the French that if they declare war on Germany, the United States would support them as best they could, or certainly at the end, and so forth. This is really very, very important, and it runs counter to this idea of the simple, naive, big America just living in luxury and watching football and baseball and football games, and then that nasty Hitler comes over and causes a lot of trouble, and so Roosevelt had to act. No, Roosevelt was interested already in 1938 and 39. It's not a secret, it's well documented that already in 1938, this is before even the Polish Danzig crisis, he called the British ambassador into the White House in a secret conference. We know about this because the ambassador himself wrote a memorandum about this meeting. And Roosevelt told him, he says, no word of this should get out. If ever any word of this gets out, I'm screwed. He says, and the whole point was to tell the British ambassador, give him this crazy advice about how to provoke war with Germany without declaring war, so that there would be war and America would be able to jump in and look like it's on the good side against Germany, backing Britain. This is fantastic that there was this level of duplicity. And of course, Roosevelt matched this in the months leading up to Pearl Harbor with a whole lot of just utterly absurd claims about Germany. One of the high points of that came in October 1941, when he gave an address. It was broadcast to the entire country on radio, claiming that he had secret documents to show that the Germans were planning to invade South America and divide up all of South America into German subordinate states. And another document, he said, that showed the Germans were planning to take over the world and abolish all the world's religions and replace it with a new religion of Mein Kampf and the sword, some crazy thing like that. All of that is absurd, but there's no historian disputes the truth of this. In fact, these claims were actually products of British intelligence that were feeding fake documents and fake things like that to Franklin Roosevelt to encourage him, because the British had their backs were to the wall. They were desperate to get the United States into the war, rather than because they would have otherwise to make peace with Germany. Anyway, Roosevelt's role in this has not been at all properly, I think, highlighted and examined by historians about how he tried to get the United States and encouraged war in Europe before it even broke out in 1939.
I know. Talk about statues that should be coming down. So
Well, it's an irony that Woodrow Wilson, I mean, maybe he deserves the statute doesn't come down for the reasons that are stated, but it's not coming down for the reasons why Americans were really mad at him back in the 1920s.
exactly.
There was a lot of unhappiness with Woodrow Wilson, but his statutes are coming down. And now the same thing's happening to Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, there's a lot of reasons to be unhappy with Winston Churchill, but he's now considered bad, not for his duplicity or for anything he did about war. As Pat Buchanan points out, Churchill thrived on war. Without war, his political career was finished. In 1939, he was on the outs in public opinion and in political life in Britain. His only hope of coming back into a political life in Britain was with war. And he liked war. I mean, this is a point that Buchanan makes over and over in his book. But the point is that today he's not criticized for that. He's criticized for remarks that he made that by today's standards are hopelessly racist. He was an imperialist. He was a big supporter of the British Empire. He was in favor of British suppression of India. I mean, it's important to remember at the beginning of the Second World War, by far the largest undemocratic and oppressive regime in the world was the British Empire.
Hundreds of Churchill was never elected.
Across Asia and Africa were under British hegemony in spite of, contrary to their wishes, and most notably in Ireland. I mean, in India, excuse me, in what is now Pakistan, India, Bangladesh. But Churchill was a man who sort of thrived on those things. And contrary to the image that was some people have tried to give, he was a man who had very little sympathy or understanding of ordinary British working people. He had no contact with the ordinary lives of people. Winston Churchill never had to buy groceries in his life. He never went on a bus or a subway. He always lived with servants. He lived well. He had to be bailed out a number of times because he went bankrupt. He was a person who lived a life very much removed from the concerns and cares of the vast majority of people in his country. But he's now criticized especially for the very derogatory things he said about blacks and Arabs and Indians and all sorts of other people. And that is already, of course, in our age, almost everybody is measured by whatever they used to think about race. And so that becomes the litmus test in 2021, the United States of America today.
I know. And that, is terrible. It's like saying we hate Ted Bundy because there's evidence that he was a bad tipper. It's like, okay, yes, that is bad. We shouldn't be, but there's so much here that you're blatantly ignoring. So tell me quickly about, I still haven't grasped the story that Buchanan goes over as to how Britain went from Chamberlain to Churchill. I know that there wasn't an election where, Churchill was voted in, so the democracy myth goes out the door there. But how did Churchill become prime minister in the late 30s?
Churchill, it's interesting. When the first time an election was held after Churchill had become prime minister, he was thrown out of office. This is the end of the Second World War. The Conservative Party was the dominant party, and so whoever headed the Conservative Party was going to be the prime minister. But Churchill himself wasn't up for election. He became prime minister in 1940. And this is a very interesting story. Churchill he was actually being funded secretly in the 1930s by people who wanted war against Germany. He gave speeches, very fiery speeches against Germany, against Hitler. This is bad. And he was known for being very, very hostile to Third Reich Germany, to Hitler. And he did have a certain following. And because of that, when war broke out in 1939, Chamberlain established a cabinet of national unity that included members of the Labour Party, and Churchill was given the job of head of the Navy, what they called First Lord of the Admiralty. That's the position he had in the First World War. But one of the plans that he cooked up as First Lord of the Admiralty was his ill-fated plan to invade Norway in 1940. It was Churchill that developed this plan to, first of all, mine the waters of Norway and then to invade Norway because Germany was importing high-grade iron ore from Sweden through Norway, and Norway was neutral. And so Germany, well, first of all, they knew about these plans, and the Germans only, well, the British were the first to break and violate Danish, Dutch, Norwegian neutrality, but then the Germans beat the British only by a very matter of days in invading Norway. And the Norwegian campaign was a complete fiasco for the British. And it was especially shocking because the British had a far, far greater navy than the Germans, and yet they were driven from Norway by the Germans in rather stunning military victory. But the blame for the defeat in Norway wasn't put at the feet of Churchill, who was responsible for the plan. The person who took the blame was Chamberlain. And ironically, Churchill became prime minister in the aftermath of the failed Norwegian campaign, even though he was the person who was responsible for this campaign. But he became prime minister just as the German then attacked in the West against France and inherited that. And of course, that was a fiasco as well. But anyway, that's one of the ironies of the war, is that Churchill's own responsibility for the fiasco of the Norway campaign was attributed to Chamberlain rather than Churchill, and it gave actually Churchill his role as a prime minister.
So, looking at the end of the Second World War with regard to American-Japanese relationships, it appears, we've already gone over this, that, provoked out of nowhere, Japan attacks America. Okay, we've dealt with that. Now that there is a conflict, Japan refusing to sign any treaty or concede in this conflict, the U.S. sends 2 nukes to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Were the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki necessary for the war to end?
Well, I've written a lengthy essay on that entitled, Was Hiroshima Necessary? And one of the very, how should I put it, morally dubious features of the Second World War was the American insistence on what was called unconditional surrender. The Japanese and the Germans were given no opportunity other than just abjectly surrendering without any condition whatsoever. In other words, if the real goal was to end the war would have ended much sooner than it did. But America insisted on just total supplication, total subordination to the United States, nothing less than what they call unconditional surrender. And it meant basically the end of the independence of these countries. Now, the Japanese had been making for months efforts to try to end the war with the United States on the one condition that the emperor would not be mistreated. He was considered a quasi-sacred symbol of Japan, and as long as he could still retain at least some nominal role, the Japanese were willing to surrender because they knew the war was over. Remember, even before the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, American air power was absolutely devastating. More people were killed in American incendiary fire bombings of Tokyo before Hiroshima and Nagasaki than were killed at Hiroshima or Nagasaki. American air power was just devastating. Remember, in the last months of the war was over in Europe, and America could turn the full brunt of its enormous military power against the Japan that even at the beginning of the war had an economy only about 1/10 of that of the United States. Anyway, the Japanese repeatedly made efforts to end the war, and America dropped the bomb on Japan. But what was decisive was not the atomic bomb, despite what people say, because actually fewer people died at Hiroshima or Nagasaki than were already killed in America's firebombing of Tokyo and other Japanese cities. What was decisive was the Soviet declaration of war a day after the Hiroshima bombing against the Soviet Union. That's when Japan decided, and that was the decisive factor in saying, we're surrendering, we're going to give up, because they would rather surrender to the Americans than to the Soviets. And that's what happened. And they conditioned it, they tried to put it in a way, and America ended up accepting the condition that Japanese leaders did make, that the emperor would not be humiliated and treated as a war criminal. And that's what happened, because it was useful to use him as a prop, you might say, for America's occupation of Japan. And unlike what happened in Germany, the occupation of Japan was a completely American affair. It was not divided into zones the way Germany had been or Austria had been after the end of the war in Europe. Japan was totally under American control. And I mean, if America had agreed to the Japanese terms earlier, it would have not only saved many American and Japanese lives, there would have been no divided Korea, for example. It's possible there wouldn't have been a communist China, because with the entrance of the Soviet Union into the war, the Red Army very quickly took over Manchuria and northern China, which was a big aid to the Chinese communists. But those are all kind of speculative side notes to the thing. A bigger point is really how very, very draconian it is to demand unconditional surrender, because it shows that whoever demands that is not really interested just in peace. It's interested in, well, now the popular word now is regime change. It wants to obliterate the old regime and impose a kind of new order on the defeated country.
So you have documented evidence that the Japanese regime was willing to surrender before the bombings of Hiroshima.
There's no dispute among historians. And again, the essay I have, Was Hiroshima Necessary? It's on our website. I think it's even on the front page of the website somewhere. Goes into great detail about all of the efforts the Japanese made through embassies in neutral countries to appeal to America to bring. I mean, already, I think it was in May or so, the Japanese had already changed the government to put in a new government that was, the whole point of which was to try to bring about an end to the war.
All right, so let's move on to 1948. Here is the original story that I got regarding the foundation of Israel. That after the war, a number of people with a Jewish background had suffered tremendous loss because of the Holocaust. In order to secure their ability to exist and their ability to flourish, they were given sort of this favoritism of having a unique state for themselves. The UN voted on this. It was all done legitimately. And today, because the Arabs are very upset, they still have 22 states they can belong to, but the small patch of land that is Israel, they don't like. And ever since then, they've been ruthlessly attacking the Jews, because partially of anti-Semitism, and another because they're just upset that they lost that land, which was justly acquired. What is wrong with that narrative?
Well, there's a lot of things. When I grew up, like most Americans, I was very pro-Israel, because that was not only the prevailing, it was the dominant narrative that we heard. I remember following very closely when I was young the 1967 Six-Day War, and I traced it all each day. I followed it very closely on maps of the area, and I was very, very fascinated by this. And there's a lot of other things that got me interested in all of that. But Americans of that era were very, very heavily influenced, I think, by the film's Exodus. It was an Otto Preminger, big, spectacular movie with major actors. Newman was
Paul Newman.
Paul Newman was one of the main actors in it. Eva Marie Saint. Anyway, it was a very high level, star-studded cast and very stirring music. And it was a movie that presented the Arabs only as very shady, dark, sinister forces. No effort was even made to present anything about them. In fact, the really bad and cynical people were the British in the movie. And so the American narrative was very, very pro-Israel even at that time. But in 1948, Truman faced the question of whether even to recognize this new Jewish state. And it's very interesting to me and important to emphasize that every American who knew anything about the Middle East and was concerned about the best interests of America pleaded with President Truman not even to recognize such a state. They all argued that recognizing a state of Israel is not only a violation of America's own pledges about democracy and peace and national determination, it's also dangerous for America's interests over the long run. Just a few months before the American recognition of Israel, a high-level official in the State Department, Lloyd Henderson, wrote a lengthy memo. And he said, if you go ahead and do this, if America recognizes Israel, we will be committed to the end of time to go to war on Israel's behalf. And he predicted this. The Secretary of State of the United States at that time was George Marshall, who was probably the most respected high-level American official during the Second World War and in 1948. He was so furious at the prospect that Truman might recognize the state of Israel that he said, Mr. President, if you do this, I do not see how I can even support you in the next election. The policy planning staff of the State Department told Truman not to recognize Israel. Marshall told Truman not to recognize Israel. And the Secretary of Defense, which had been established under James Forrestal, also said, you are putting domestic political concerns ahead of what's best for the United States. They all urged him not even to recognize. Now, this wasn't a question of military support. This was even recognizing this state. Because, and also, yes, it's true, the General Assembly voted to divide the country into Jewish and Arab states, but it had no authority to do that. If this was not carried out by some mandate of the people who lived there at the time, the Jews made up a distinct minority of the population of Palestine at that time. And even that vote was only engineered by massive bribery and threats against various countries at the time in the United Nations. But even more than that, it was only done by the United Nations General Assembly. The United States has violated itself numerous General Assembly resolutions, even Security Council resolutions. And so that those people who cite the General Assembly resolution as some sort of mandate are the same people who ignore the General Assembly resolutions on issues that they don't agree with. But that's another matter. I call the U.S. recognition of Israel by Truman the original sin of American Middle East policy. And Truman himself said at the time, he said, gentlemen, I have lots of Jewish voters to answer to, and I don't have any Arabs, and that's why I'm going to recognize Israel. At another point, he said, Jesus Christ couldn't keep him happy while he was on earth, and I don't see how I can do it. He said in his memoirs, he said he never got so much pressure as he did on any issue as he did over the recognition of the state of Israel. Again, this was important, and also it was a major break because, as Secretary of State Marshall said at the time, Truman put domestic political considerations ahead of what was good for the world and what was good for the United States. And as Lloyd Henderson, who is a high-level U.S. ambassador and State Department official, predicted, America has been committed to all of Israel's actions ever since, with, I think, dire consequences for the world. Now, I don't have any particular beef with Israel, but it is dangerous when any country makes foreign policy based upon domestic political concerns and not what's good for the country as a whole and for the world as a whole. And the United States did that in 1948 by when it recognized the state of Israel.
And Lindsey Graham brags about it on a daily basis. Is it true that there were Zionist gangs referred to as Ergon, Stern, and Haganah, who before 1948 were intentionally bombing civilians in order to build Zionist settlements?
Well, one of the catchphrases that you'll hear a lot in the media is how terrible terrorism is. Yeah, terrorism's not good. Nobody likes terrorism. But every political movement in the modern era, before it actually takes power, engages in terrorism.
Yeah.
Before Ireland was a republic, the Irish nationalists were terrorists, and they were denounced as terrorists. because terrorists don't have bombers. They don't have artillery. They don't have the weapons that a state does. Denouncing terrorism is only a way of denouncing any political political movement that doesn't have a state, because a state apparatus is able to have armies, bombers, missiles, and so forth. And so denouncing, sure, terrorism is a terrible thing, just like war is a terrible thing. But terrorism is considered okay if the terrorists eventually win. And that's what happened in Palestine. The first people to introduce quote unquote terrorism into Palestine were the Zionists. And the groups were Irgun, the Stern Gang, it was called the Fighters for the Freedom of Israel, and the Haganah. Now the Haganah was more or less the official Jewish agency, more or less official military arm of the government in shadow government of the Zionists. The Stern Gang and the Irgun were much smaller, but they were terrorist organizations. And they regarded not only the Arabs, but also the British as very big bad guys that had to be eliminated. And in fact, the British just finally washed their hands of the whole thing in 1948 and walked out. And that's when independence was declared. But one of the leaders of the Haganah, of the Irgun, was Menachem Begin. He was a terrorist. He was involved in the bombing of the King David Hotel, which resulted in the deaths of many innocent people. It was the headquarters of the British occupation forces or mandate forces there. But he later became the Prime Minister of Israel and was treated with respect. That's what happens when people win. George Washington was considered a terrorist by the British in the American Revolutionary War. And I'm sure if the American Revolution had taken place in the 20th century, they would have used all the familiar tools that terrorists use nowadays, and improvised explosive devices and RPGs and all that. But at that time, they didn't have the devices with the same sophistication as we had today. But yeah, I mean, the Zionists use terrorism, the Arabs use terrorism, because the Palestinians, that's all they have. They don't have a state. They don't have an army of their own. And that's what they do. But it's important to realize, yeah, that if terrorism's so terrible, well, then we should demand that Israel repudiate its past and its leaders for having done so. Now, I'm not, again, trying to point fingers just in one direction. This is history. This is what happens. And of course, Israel is now established as a state and millions of Jews live there. And I'm not in favor of throwing people into the sea or anything like that. But it's important that American policy, not that it takes sides on the side of Israel or of the Palestinians or one side or the other. The important thing is to try to do things that are judicious, that are fair, and based on the best interests of the world and of America, not based on some blinkered, closed-minded support for one side in ignoring all the other considerations.
Yeah, that's really important. I remember bin Laden writing about that. I think it was in 1998, where he had said that basically their plan is to blockade Iraq and beat the heck out of Iraq until Saddam goes down, because it's the biggest rival to Israeli power in the region in the 90s. So yeah, these really do turn out to large-scale conflicts. It's not just politics.
If there's any one theme that I try to emphasize, it's to be very, very careful about war. War has its own dynamic. Countries should be very reluctant to that. Americans have paid a high price. They're not aware of it in the same sense that other countries have been about war, because the wars, except for 9/11, I guess, don't affect us directly. But they have terrible consequences for our country in the world and for, of course, the rest of the world. But I think that whatever you can say about the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, other wars, certainly America's launching of the war against Iraq in 2003 is just inexcusable. It was launched on the basis of lies and deceit. It caused enormous destruction. And everyone who knew anything about the Middle East urged the United States not to go ahead and do this. Almost, I mean, there was widespread opposition to doing that, and George Bush went ahead with it anyway. And what's incredible to me, what is really shameful, is the way in which people who justified and supported that war are still treated with respect and honor by our media. And
Bill
the
Crystal.
politicians are still, who were behind that, are still given honor or respect in a way that they should be just shunned, I think, and disgraced. But that's the way
He's
it works in America.
he's in the White House right now. Do you have
Right,
a
right, including Mr. Biden, exactly. Yeah.
I could talk to you forever. Do you have another 30 minutes, Mr. Weber?
Okay, yeah, I guess so. Uh-huh.
Thank you so much. What was the USS Liberty event in 1967 and the Six-Day War?
This is becoming a little bit like a smorgasbord, a buffet of historical topics.
I'm trying to
Well,
go in order.
no, it's especially appropriate you should mention that because today is the anniversary of the attack on the USS Liberty in 1967. That needs to be better known, really. And there are several items on our website today about the USS Liberty incident. It's in 1967 during the Six-Day War, which I, as I mentioned earlier, remember vividly from my youth, that Israeli warplanes and torpedo boats attacked a U.S. Intelligence ship in the international waters in the Mediterranean, the USS Liberty. Interestingly enough, a very appropriately named ship, I think, for reasons. But anyway, the United States attacked this ship and tried to sink it. It's a very shameful event in history. We sell a book on this subject called Blood in the Water by a woman writer named Joan Mellon, which is just hair-raising in what it says about the efforts of the Johnson administration to cover up its own sanctioning of this Israeli attack on an American ship. If any other country had did it, we would have declared war. But the Israelis claimed that it was a case of mistaken identity. None of the members of the USS Liberty believe that. Many other historians think that's just a blatant lie. And they cite evidence to show that Lyndon Johnson deliberately called back American naval support for the USS Liberty against the Israeli attackers because he didn't want to embarrass America's ally, the Israelis. That's a very astonishing thing. It means that Lyndon Johnson put the lives of and the interests of Israel ahead of the lives and interests of Americans, even American naval personnel, in this case. That's a very, very, well, some people say treacherous, treasonous, despicable thing to have done. But in any case, it showed the way the entire USS Liberty incident has been suppressed and played down are all examples of just the enormous power that people call it the pro-Israel lobby, the Zionist lobby, Jewish lobby, whatever we're going to call it, has in our society, that we haven't made movies about this. The captain of the USS Liberty was given the Congressional Medal of Honor for his heroic and quick-witted action during the attack, which saved the lives, although 35 Americans were killed in the attack. The ship was not sunk, almost miraculously, because there was a big hole in the side. It could have very easily sunk. Captain McDougal was given the Congressional Medal of Honor. Normally, the Congressional Medal of Honor is given by the President of the United States in person in the White House. This is the only case in which the Congressional Medal of Honor was given in a quiet, ceremony without press, held in a naval facility and not by the President of the United States, because, well, some people think that President Johnson didn't have the nerve to confront the very man who he had sanctioned his own death in telling the American Navy to withdraw from support against the Israeli attackers during the attack. But anyway, it's a very shameful episode, and this is even more. I mean, we see this both with the Trump and Biden administrations. This open-ended support for Israel that's a reflection of the tremendous power domestically, so that our politicians put the interests, again, their own interests of getting reelected and of their party and of their reputation here in America above the interests of what's good for the world, for America, for humanity, and just doing what's right.
And what was the official narrative of the 1967 war is that the Arab nations conspired simultaneously to attack Israel in hopes of turning it back over into Arab hands. Is that an accurate portrayal of events?
Well, people forget it was actually Israel that attacked first, not the Arabs, not the Egyptians. But again, that's all sort of lost in all of this because, boy, those bad Arabs. In fact, one of the very dangerous things, I think, in history is to look at, and it's understandable because this is how people are used to it in our media and so forth, to look at history in terms of good guys and bad guys.
Yeah.
This is a very dangerous thing. Leaders should understand, of course, that as in all human beings and all society, there's good and bad. But it's especially obvious how simplistic and wrong this is because the good guys of one year can become the bad guys of another year. America's good guys in World War II included Joseph Stalin. A few years later, he was a big, big bad guy. Mao Zedong was a bad guy, and then Nixon visited with him. Well, then he's a sort of not so bad guy, I guess. I guess he was never exactly a good guy. Saddam Hussein was more or less acceptable because the United States backed Saddam Hussein when he was fighting a war that he provoked against Iran for 8 years. But then, after all that was over, then he's a bad guy. Anyway, this is a very simplistic and dangerous way to look at international affairs. But people, it's an easy thing for the public to do. And so if the media can create a good guy, bad guy kind of dichotomy or Manichaean good and bad, then that's a shorthand for people. And also it's necessary in a democratic society. This is a theme of the book Advance to Barbarism that I recommend. He points out that in a modern democratic society, in order to get the public, it's necessary to make the propaganda very simplistic, very raw, very childlike. Good guys, bad guys. It's not only a bad guy. He's going to take over the world. He's going to kill your children and so forth. But the consequences are, of course, very dangerous and bad and harmful for America and the world. I mean, as bad as all of those things are in the past, and again, I'm going back to a point that Buchanan made. America is right now carrying out policy in the world that is marked by what the Greeks called hubris, a kind of arrogance, a kind of assumption that we know better. We're the great model for the world. We saw echoes of this in all of the recent presidents, but we see it now in the Biden administration. Biden, even before he came into the White House, was talking about how America is once again going to be the leader of the world. Well, this is pretty high stuff coming from a man whose own country has such tremendous problems internally, when there's homeless people living all around within blocks of the White House, when the crime rate is just exorbitant here in our cities, in a country that he says is bedeviled by an entrenched, horrible systemic racism so awful we've got to eradicate it. And this is the same country he says is going to be the leader of the world. As they say, physician, heal thyself first before you start telling other countries how to do things. But anyway, the bigger point is this is dangerous hubris, really. And in the name of democracy or some noble sounding phrases, countries like this can go to war. It's one of the reasons why, although I was never a fan of Donald Trump, at least he didn't launch any new wars. And he had, I think, a very healthy understanding that war was going to be ruinous for his own legacy. I'm more worried now about the Biden administration doing things in the name of democracy or equality or whatever it happens to be that can be very, very dangerous for the future, in the same way that Woodrow Wilson got America into the First World War. In fact, Wilson got America into a lot of wars. He invaded a lot of other countries too. But anyway, looking from and that's why, to go back to the points you raised at the very beginning of this talk, it's important to learn from history. Important to learn about the grave dangers of countries that act in an arrogant way and a way that does not take into account the real constellation of forces in the world. And we see over and over countries that go beyond what their real power is and end up with catastrophic consequences for themselves and humanity.
What was the Gulf of Tonkin incident?
Well, I remember that vividly, and I'm very pleased the Gulf of Tonkin incident was in 1964. Lyndon Johnson announced to the world that North Vietnamese warships had blatantly and without provocation attacked American ships on international waters in the Gulf of Tonkin outside of Vietnam. Now, it later turned out there was sort of an incident. Nobody was killed. There was some confusion. Apparently, of these two incidents, the second one didn't even happen. The first one, it's still a little cloudy. But the important thing is that Johnson took this rather unimportant incident, played it up, exaggerated it, and used it as an excuse to demand from Congress an open-ended blank check authorization for whatever military force he thought was necessary to prosecute the war in Vietnam. It's called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. At the time, members of Congress and the press did not fully understand how deceitful Johnson's representation of the reality was. But this resolution, and this is at a time when Americans were far more trusting of their political leaders, they could hardly believe that Lyndon Johnson would lie and deceive on this level. And so the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was in the House of Representatives, did not receive a single dissenting vote. It was voted for unanimously. Nobody questioned it. In the Senate of the United States, which had 100 members, there were only 2 senators that had the, courage to vote against it. And I remember the mood at the time. The mood in the time in America was, boy, if you vote against it, you're practically a traitor to America. That was the mood. The only 2 senators to vote against it were Ernst Gruening of Alaska and Wayne Morse of Oregon. And I am pleased that as a young man, I even met Wayne Morse, who was a very principled man, and a man who should be remembered for his stalwartness, his decency, and his courage in voting against the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. And he voted against it mainly on the fact that it was a declaration of war it was going to war without a declaration of war. It was unconstitutional. His main objection, see, he didn't know, and people didn't know just how shabby the justification how shabby the justification was that was given for the resolution. He just knew it was unconstitutional, and that was enough for him to vote against it. But no one else at that time had the courage, except Ernst Gruening of Alaska, to vote against it. Now, later, after the war became more and more obviously a big morass and a mess, and then people said, well, wait a minute here, let's see, is this really justified? And many people said later, oh, well, I guess we made a big mistake. Well, no kidding. Eventually, even Robert McNamara, who was Secretary of State, said, well, what we did would have been criminal. As he said, if we had lost the war, we would have been prosecuted as war criminals. But Americans don't like to hear that. People don't want to hear that. They want to think we're the good guys. Whatever we do is good. And it's an embarrassment for many people even to talk about the Vietnam War or the Iraq War in an objective way, because we give a kind of pass to politicians because wars don't have the terrible consequences they have for others. It's a remarkable thing that in the United States, Tony Blair is looked upon with disdain and contempt for his support of the Iraq War. A similar kind of indignation, which I think is entirely justified, is not given by the Americans to George W. Bush or Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or many others who supported the 2003 U.S. bombing, invasion, attack against Iraq.
What are some important aspects that are often overlooked about the American Civil War from 1861 to 1865?
Well, one point I would make very strongly is that the causes for the secession of the South are not the same as the causes of the Civil War. Now, I know that's people will say, well, how did the war begin? The South seceding did not necessarily mean there was going to be a war. The North could have let the South go on the thinking that twofold. First, if part of a country is so determined to leave, they're willing to do all of that, it's not worth trying to force them back in. And second, even if some effort could be made to force them back in, it's not worth killing a lot of people to make that happen. If James Buchanan and some others had been president, the Confederacy might have become a reality. But Lincoln was determined, as he saw it, to uphold the Constitution and to uphold the integrity of the United States of America. And that made the war inevitable. And I think it also made the defeat of the Confederacy inevitable, because it was only a matter of time, I think, before almost inevitably the much greater military, ultimately military and economic power of the North would prevail. But it took a long time. But that's one of the main points I would make. There's I mean, I think it's wrong to feel rancor. I think it was good to, after the Civil War, to try to set aside feelings of revenge and hostility towards the South or the North or whatever. Because, yeah, as bad as these things are, it's better to go ahead into the future in this. But today, in fact, there's far more hatred and rancor about the Civil War than I've seen since, well, the period just after the Civil War. I mean, it's a very sad thing, because now everything has become so tied up with attitudes about race. But that's a kind of silly way of looking, I think, at the American Civil War. But another point, too, is that no one at the beginning of the Civil War, North or South, anticipated anything like the tremendous loss of life. 200, 300,000 lives, young lives lost, the tremendous destruction in the South, all of that. Was it really worth it? I question very much whether the price was worth anything, even one part of all of that. Having said that, I mean, I try to have sympathy or understanding for the position both of the North and the South. But I think the main point, to go back to my main point, is Southern secession did not make war inevitable. What made it inevitable was the decision by Lincoln to use military force to bring back the South forcibly into the Union. And Lincoln, in a sense, miscalculated too. He thought that pro-federal or pro-Union sympathy was much greater in the South than it actually was. Of course, on both sides, each of them thought that after one battle or two, their side would prevail. The North would defeat the South, or somebody would win. The other side would say, okay, you're right, we give up, let us go, or whatever, we'll just give up. But no, that didn't happen. And that's often the case in wars, that just as the Japanese miscalculated at Pearl Harbor, the South miscalculated in firing on Fort Sumter. There's many examples in history like that.
Did the Spanish sink the USS Maine in 1898?
Well, there's a long essay by me on that subject, too, on the Spanish-American War. That's another very, very key event in American history, because it represents the moment when the United States went from being a republic focused on its own concerns to being an imperial power. The Spanish-American War meant that the United States was going to, and it was justified at the time by many people, to be an imperial power with the grandeur and the sweep and the scope and the pride that Britain and France and Germany and other countries had in being big empires. And America, through the Spanish-American War, acquired the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and a protectorate over Cuba, essentially a colony, although it was nominally independent, but essentially a colony of the United States. But the pretext given for the war was the explosion on the USS Maine. The Spanish desperately asked for an international commission to investigate it. They said we had nothing to do with it. It's impossible to believe, even on the face of it, that they would do it, because they had no motive. The last thing Spain wanted was war with the United States, because the United States was more powerful. But the American media and American politicians seized upon the sinking of the USS Maine in the Havana Harbor, explosion there, as a pretext to go to war against Spain. And the United States acquired Puerto Rico, Philippines. And was that really to the advantage of the United States? Was it really a good thing that we did all of that? I think the answer is not a very gratifying one. But at the time, there was a tremendous amount of hubris, of arrogance that while we're a great power, we're going to be an imperial power, and we're going to have colonies, and we're going to be, and there a lot of talk about how taking over the Philippines would mean then we'd open up China, and that would be ours for the taking, and so on and so forth. But again, this was a very seminal event, and it was also the beginning. There was a very large and important anti-war movement in America at that time. That's very interesting, and I discussed that in this long essay I wrote too. And all sorts of very, I think, cogent, good reasons were given why the United States should not be involved should not prosecute the Spanish-American War, and especially should not try to posit itself as an imperial power, and how dangerous it is. For one thing, it's contrary to what we supposedly stand for as a country. I mean, there's a lot of other reasons as well. But I'm glad you brought it up. But it's again, on that subject, I recommend the essay I wrote on that subject.
Of course, and links to all Mr. Weber's articles will be in the description below. Two more questions for you, Mr. Weber. What is the most important thing you learned from the contributions of Murray and Rothbard?
Murray Rothbard was a great man. He was arguably the leading intellectual of American libertarianism during his lifetime. He comes from an interesting background. He grew up in a communist, Marxist youth background as a boy. He said when he grew up, everyone was either a member of the Communist Party or a supporter of the Communist Party in New York. And he grew up in that environment. And for some reason that only heaven knows, he decided at an early age that he didn't go along with that. One of his early memories, he said, was during the Spanish Civil War. He was with a group of people in New York, all Jewish, and they're all talking about how terrible Franco is and how we have to support the Republicans in the war against fascism. And little Murray Rothbard was just a kid, and he had a little high voice then and later in life, and he says, "Oh, what's so wrong with Franco anyway?" And everybody looked at him with shock. How could you even say that about Franco? I mean, Franco's a bad guy. He's a bad guy. Well, but Murray Rothbard was not only a very scholarly, intelligent man who was able to write with great knowledge and discernment about economics and about history in a scholarly way. He was also a very effective and persuasive polemicist. He could write very punchy essays. His mind was just very impressive in that way. I had a few meetings with Rothbard, but I had a long discussion with him at his home when he was living in Las Vegas. In the last years of his life, he was teaching at University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and I talked with him at quite a lot of length. But anyway, he was very influential. And there's an essay on our website, which I recommend by him, and I think is very worth reading and holds up very well over time, entitled "On the Importance of Revisionism in Our Time." And he talks in this essay, perhaps more eloquently than I can, about why a realistic understanding of history is important to understand our own times and see clearly toward the future. He deals, especially in this essay, with this very simplistic view that prevails in America about the Second World War. We're the good guys. There's the good guys and bad guys. And Americans may argue about, there's a lot of agreement that the Iraq War was a mistake, the Vietnam War was a fiasco, First World War, Spanish-American War. Many people are willing to acknowledge, well, it's not so quite clear-cut as it was at the time about those wars. But Murray Rothbard emphasizes that it's also equally simplistic to talk about even the Second World War in this way, which has been glorified over and over in Hollywood and movies and so forth as the good war, the war and I emphasize this as well because the legacy or the lessons, quote unquote, that we're supposed to learn from the Second World War continue to play a very, very important role in the popular narrative and popular idea about history in our America today.
Final question, what is the most important thing you learned from the contributions of Ralph Raico?
Ralph Raico was another man I'm pleased to have known. He wrote with great learnedness and discernment about all these questions of 20th century history, America's role in both the world wars, about the Second World War. He was a professor for years in State University, New York State University in Buffalo. Anyway, we lived in Buffalo, but really a great writer as well. And I recommend almost anything he wrote as well. Yeah, and his writings over the years covered a great deal of different subjects. He, as a young man, he was a kind of acolyte of Ayn Rand in New York City, and he sort of got into all of this through that connection. But he's also a person that had his own colorful anecdotes and stories about Ayn Rand and what she was like and her outlook and her personality and so forth. But anyway, to go back more seriously, both Murray Rothbard, Ralph Raico, very, very good, solid historians. And so to go back to a point made earlier with you, to understand history, a lot of it depends on who we trust, who's reliable. And Ralph Raico, Murray Rothbard, Pat Buchanan, Ron Paul is very good about a lot of these issues. Although he doesn't talk so much about history, but he's very good about, I think, international affairs. Those are all reliable people. I often put essays, insofar as I think they're relevant to history and so forth, or world affairs on our website by Ron Paul. And of course, as I said, there's a lot of material by Murray Rothbard on our website, but almost everything he had to say is well worth reading. Even if you don't agree with it, he has an insight and a perspective that's really very, very valuable. And that's true of Raico as well. And also some of the other historians you've had connected with the Libertarian Institute have been very good. And I haven't read it yet, but Scott Horton has this new book about the Iraq War. I think that's, I haven't read yet, but based on what I have seen, it's probably very good as well. And
the good thing about it is it actually covers all 7 that the U.S. are currently involved in and their history. It's called Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. So it actually goes over, his first book, Fool's Errand, is strictly about Afghanistan and Iraq War I. But yeah, Fool's Errand is great because it goes over it goes over everything.
Well, one of the sad things, again, it goes back to a point, is Americans, well, if you ask Americans about taxes or about schools or about roads or about vaccinations, everybody has an opinion because it affects all of us directly. We all pay taxes, or we certainly, well, even if we don't pay federal taxes, we pay sales taxes. Everybody's concerned about vaccinations because we're all told to get vaccinations and so forth. All those issues affect us in our lives, our schools. Either we were in schools or our children are in schools and so forth. Social Security, everybody has an opinion about that, or bureaucracy. But people do not have very often very informed opinions about world affairs, about international politics, about military policy, because it doesn't affect us directly. And that's sad and unfortunate because the cost, both in monetary, tax terms, money terms, and of human lives, and for our country as a kind of as a society, is a very important one. And it's understandable, as I said, why people might not have the same passion about Afghanistan or about Iraq or whatever, or Iran, as they do about vaccinations. But the consequences are still very major ones. And it's very important, at least for people who are and should be leaders. But unfortunately, our political system, I regard as so corrupt that with only a very, very few exceptions, politicians put getting reelected and their stature within the system ahead of what's really good for America and the world.
Well, thank you to everyone for watching. Keith Knight Don't Tread on Anyone, as well as the Libertarian Institute. Check out the Institute for Historical Review. All links will be in the description below, as well as my page at the Libertarian Institute. Mr. Weber, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.